200 miles away from where 16-year-old Tim Hudson walked into a federal courthouse. This is where his 18-year-old stepsister, Anna Kepner, would have graduated from this month. I'm your Titusville community correspondent, James Sparvero. I can show you outside Temple Christian School where a cross still marks where Anna parked her car right up until that family cruise back in November, where federal prosecutors say her 16-year-old stepbrother raped and strangled her in the room they were sharing. As Tim Hudson was in Miami Wednesday for a bond hearing, I called Anna Kepner's dad, Chris, who told me he wanted the judge to hold Tim Hudson until trial, but instead Hudson's going home to his family in Hernando County, where he's been staying for months.
I want him in custody. I think that if he was in custody, we would possibly get more out of this kid, considering that he's saying that he doesn't remember. If him being free and be able to do what he wants, he's put it in the back of his mind like there's no consequences for his actions.
Anna Kepner's actions left a lasting impact on her community. Since November, students and parents have told me so much about how they adored her.
She would turn a sad room into a happy room. She was just a light.
That light shining at the school's graduation ceremony this month. Chris Kepner talked to me about accepting his daughter's diploma.
It was very nice what the school did for us. The school gave us the yearbook, and they made a whole page about Anna.
And now Chris Kepner told me the school's making his daughter's parking spot a permanent memorial for Anna, and one that never chips or fades. Like her grandfather, Chris told me that Anna wanted to join the Navy after graduation. In Brevard County, I'm your Titusville community correspondent, James Sparvero, News 6.
3 to 5 minutes. That is how long federal prosecutors say it took for a 16-year-old boy to strangle his 18-year-old stepsister to death. Not a flash of panic. Not an instant of rage that consumed someone before they even understood what their own hands were doing. 3 to 5 minutes is a duration you can measure. It is long enough to brew a cup of tea. Long enough to wait through 2 commercial breaks. Long enough, prosecutors argue, for someone to know precisely what they are doing, to feel a body stop struggling beneath them, and to keep going anyway. He didn't stop. According to the case against him, he didn't stop until she was gone. And when it was over, when the room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet after something irreversible has happened inside them, prosecutors say he hid her body underneath her own bed. He covered her, according to court documents, with a box of life vests. The very objects designed to keep a person breathing at sea were used, allegedly, to make sure that no one found her until the sun came up and the ship was that much closer to land. Her name was Anna Kepner. She was 18 years old, a cheerleader, a straight-A student, a girl from a small city on Florida's Space Coast who, by every account from the people who loved her, was exactly the kind of person this world needed more of. Happy, easy to be around. The kind of bright that doesn't dim a room but fills it. She should be walking across a graduation stage right now. Somewhere in Florida, a tassel should be moving from one side of a cap to the other. A diploma should be sliding into her hands. A crowd of parents should be cheering a name that belongs to a living person standing in front of them. Instead, her father stood on that stage alone. He accepted her diploma in her place, in front of a gymnasium full of people honoring graduates who got to grow up. Here is the detail that should make you sit forward in your chair, because it is the detail that turns this from a tragedy into something closer to outrage. The boy accused of doing this to her, her stepbrother, someone she shared a cabin with on a family cruise, someone her own grandparents once described as close to her, has spent most of the time since her death as a free person. Not behind bars awaiting trial, not under the kind of restriction the public might assume comes standard with a murder charge. Free. Walking out of federal courthouses in broad daylight while reporters' cameras tracked his every step. Multiple times, federal prosecutors stood in front of a judge and argued that this teenager poses a danger to the public. Multiple times, the system that is supposed to weigh that danger against the presumption of innocence chose, for one procedural reason or another, not to lock him away while the case against him unfolded. Anna's own father, a man who helped raise this boy, who built a blended family with him at the dinner table, has said publicly that his stepson should not be free, should not be near children, should not be near women, period. How does a case this serious end up with the accused walking the streets of Florida while his sister's family waits for a trial date? The answer involves a stretch of ocean that belongs to no country, a piece of maritime law most Americans have never had reason to learn. A family fractured along two completely opposite accounts of what kind of person this boy is, and evidence so disturbing that even hardened federal prosecutors chose their words carefully when describing it in open court. This is the story of what happened to Anna Kepner aboard the Carnival Horizon in November of 2025. It is also, and this matters, a story that has not ended. No jury has reached a verdict. No judge has handed down a sentence. Nothing about this case is settled, except the fact that a young woman with her whole life ahead of her is gone, and the boy accused of taking that life from her is, as you are hearing this, still waiting for his trial, a trial currently scheduled for September of 2026. Everything you are about to hear comes from federal court filings, unsealed transcripts, statements from law enforcement, and on-the-record interviews given by the people closest to this case. And one truth sits underneath every single sentence of it. Timothy Hudson has pleaded not guilty. He is, under the law that governs every person in this country, presumed innocent until a jury says otherwise. Keep that in your mind as we walk through what the government says happened. Hold both truths at once, the presumption the law demands and the unease that the evidence, as alleged, is designed to create. This is not a closed case being revisited with the comfortable benefit of hindsight. This is a case unfolding in real time, with hearings still being scheduled, evidence still being filed under seal, and a trial date that hasn't even arrived yet. Most true crime stories you encounter have already reached their ending. A verdict, a sentence, an appeal exhausted or pending. This one hasn't, which means everything you're about to hear is, in a very real sense, still being written, and the final chapter of it is going to be decided by 12 strangers in a Miami courtroom sometime after September. Anna Marie Kepner grew up in Titusville, Florida, a city that sits along the Space Coast, close enough to Cape Canaveral that the sky over her childhood was occasionally split open by rocket launches, plumes of white smoke rising over a town that otherwise moved at the unremarkable pace of small-city American life. She attended Temple Christian School. She was a cheerleader there. She carried straight A's through her classes. The adjectives that come up again and again when people who knew her describe Anna are almost disarmingly simple: happy, bubbly, bright future ahead of her. Not the language of eulogy written for cameras, the language of people who are still, months later, struggling to process the fact that those adjectives now have to be spoken in the past tense. Her family, like a great many American families, was blended. Her father, Christopher Kepner, was married to a woman named Chantel Hudson. Through that marriage came step-siblings, children who hadn't grown up under the same roof from birth, who hadn't shared a childhood bedroom or a string of family Christmases stretching back to infancy, but who were, in the modern shorthand families use, now simply siblings. Among them was a boy 16 years old at the time, Timothy Hudson. In November of 2025, the family planned a cruise. 6 nights aboard Carnival Cruise Line's ship, the Horizon, departing from the port of Miami, with stops scheduled along the way in Georgetown, Grand Cayman, Ocho Rios, Jamaica, and Cozumel, Mexico. This is the kind of trip that gets booked many months in advance, that gets talked about at the dinner table in the weeks leading up to it, that fills phones with photos of pool decks and sunset horizons, and the particular, specific joy of a family vacation where, for a few days, nobody has to go to work or school. On November 2nd, 2025, the Kepner Hudson family boarded that ship. Anna, her father, her paternal grandparents, her 14-year-old half-brother, her 10-year-old half-sister, her stepmother Chantel, her stepbrother Timothy, and a 9-year-old stepsister. A full, layered, multi-generational family, the kind that requires its own seating chart at dinner, the kind where cabins get assigned not by who is closest in blood, but by who is closest in age, by who makes logistical sense to room together for 6 nights at sea. Anna and Timothy were assigned to share a cabin, cabin 8343. A third teenager, another sibling, was also staying in that room. Now here is something that deserves to sit uncomfortably with you, because it already sat uncomfortably with the people closest to Anna before any of this happened. According to her ex-boyfriend, Anna had previously expressed discomfort around her stepbrother. He has stated publicly that on at least one occasion before the cruise, Timothy attempted to climb on top of her while she was lying down. That is the account from someone who knew her intimately, who she presumably trusted enough to mention something that unsettling to. And yet, in the same breath, from a different corner of the family, Anna's own grandparents have described her and Timothy as having been very close. Not estranged step-siblings tolerating each other through obligation. Close. The kind of relationship that, on paper, looks nothing like the discomfort her ex-boyfriend described. Hold both of those accounts in your head at the same time, because the family itself seems to be holding both of them, and neither version cancels the other out cleanly. Maybe closeness and discomfort coexisted, the way complicated family relationships often allow contradictory things to be simultaneously true. Maybe one account is more accurate than the other. What we know for certain is this. By the night of November 6, 2025, whatever existed between Anna Kepner and her stepbrother, warmth, tension, something harder to name, was about to end in a locked cabin, in the middle of the ocean, in a way that would eventually require a federal grand jury to get involved. It's worth dwelling for a moment on how ordinary the decision to room them together almost certainly felt at the time. Families booking multi-cabin cruises routinely group children by age rather than by biological relationship, simply because it's logistically efficient, and because in most households, step-siblings close in age really do become something resembling real siblings over time. Nobody books a family cruise anticipating tragedy. Nobody looks at a cabin assignment sheet and senses danger in it. The mundane practicality of that decision, two teenagers, close enough in age, sharing a room to save space and money on a 6-night trip, is precisely what makes the outcome so difficult to reconcile. This wasn't a household ignoring an obvious warning sign. It was a family making the same kind of unremarkable logistical choice that thousands of blended families make every single year, on cruises and in everyday life, without incident. Who? An 18-year-old cheerleader and her 16-year-old stepbrother sharing a cabin on a family cruise. What? A death that the medical examiner would classify as a homicide. Where? International waters, aboard a Carnival cruise ship, somewhere between the Caribbean and Miami. When? The night of November 6th into the early morning hours of November 7th, 2025. Those are the facts that exist without controversy. Everything else, every motive, every intention, every second of what actually happened behind a closed cabin door is the subject of an ongoing federal case that has not yet gone to trial. Let's walk through the timeline, because in a case built almost entirely on circumstantial and forensic evidence rather than eyewitness testimony to the act itself, the timeline is everything. Every minute, prosecutors have been able to reconstruct functions as a brick in the wall of their argument. Every gap in that timeline is a space the defense can stand in and ask the jury to doubt. Picture the ship itself for a moment, because the setting matters more than it might first seem. The Carnival horizon is enormous, more than 1,000 feet of steel moving through dark water, thousands of passengers, dozens of decks stacked one on top of another like a floating city that never quite goes silent. Engines hum constantly beneath your feet. Elevators chime. Somewhere, at almost any hour, music is playing for someone celebrating something. It is built, deliberately, to feel safe, to feel like an extension of home, a controlled environment where families can let their guard down precisely because every detail has supposedly been engineered for comfort and security. That illusion of total safety is part of what makes this case so unsettling. Whatever happened inside cabin 8343 happened behind a door identical to 1,000 other doors on that ship, in a hallway where families were sleeping doors away, on a vessel that, on paper, exists specifically to protect the people inside it. According to prosecutors, Anna left the family dinner table early on the evening of November 6th. She told relatives she wasn't feeling well, mouth pain from her braces, an upset stomach, the kind of low-grade complaint that draws no attention, that generates no concern, that every parent and sibling in America has heard 1,000 times without a second thought. She walked back to cabin 8343, alone. Closed-circuit television cameras positioned throughout the ship's corridors allegedly captured her entering that cabin at 7:38 p.m. She was never seen leaving it again. At 8:14 p.m., according to unsealed court records, Anna used her cell phone for the final time in her life. We don't know, at least not from what has been made public, exactly what she was doing on that phone in those last moments. Texting a friend, scrolling through something forgettable, replying to a message from earlier in the day. Whatever it was, it is the last digital exhale of a person who, 36 minutes earlier, had simply excused herself from dinner because her stomach hurt. Somewhere in the time after that final phone use, prosecutors alleged that Timothy Hudson sexually assaulted her. The autopsy, according to court filings, determined that Anna had been pinned down and raped while she was still alive. A detail prosecutors have emphasized, specifically because it establishes both the violence of the act and the fact that she was conscious, present, aware, for at least part of what was happening to her. And then, prosecutors say, he strangled her. Mechanical asphyxiation, the Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's Office determined, an object or physical force cutting off the body's ability to draw breath until the body simply stops. Prosecutors have told the court they believe this process took 3 to 5 minutes. They have been deliberate about stating that time frame out loud, in open court, because of what it implies about intention. A struggle that resolves in seconds might be argued as an accident, a tragic and sudden escalation nobody could have predicted. A struggle that stretches across 3 to 5 minutes requires something else. It requires, at minimum, the physical and psychological capacity to continue an act after its lethal trajectory should already be clear to the person committing it. Now here is where the story turns from horrifying to something almost unbearably cold, because of what happened next in that cabin, according to a third witness who had no idea what he was walking into. Anna's 13-year-old half-brother, a child, sharing that same general living space on the ship, told investigators that he moved in and out of the cabin several times that evening after dinner. Ordinary behavior, grabbing a charger, checking on something. The unremarkable choreography of siblings on a family trip, weaving in and out of shared space without a thought. But at 12:09 a.m. on November 7th, when this 13-year-old tried to come back into the cabin to go to sleep, something stopped him at the threshold. Timothy put his arm out, blocked the door physically, told the younger boy that he was changing and that he needed to wait, so the boy waited. In the hallway, outside the room he shared with his sister, who was at that point, according to the case the government has built, already dead inside it, hidden beneath her own bed, covered by a box of life vests. He stood there, 13 years old, with no idea what was on the other side of that door, simply doing what an older sibling told him to do. And while he waited, he noticed something. He later described it as weird. Every light in the cabin was on, not the soft, low light of a room being readied for sleep. Every light, fully illuminated, blazing through whatever gap existed beneath the door, at nearly midnight, while his stepbrother stood in the doorway insisting he simply needed a few more minutes to change clothes. How long does it actually take to change clothes? Compare that to how long it might take to move a body underneath a bed frame, to find a box of life vests and arrange them to conceal what's beneath, to check that nothing is visible from the doorway, that nothing looks wrong to a 13-year-old who simply wants to go to sleep. We do not know precisely what was happening on the other side of that door during those minutes, but the government's theory of the case asks the jury to believe that whatever was happening, it required every light in the room and enough time that a child noticed the wait. Eventually, the door opened. The 13-year-old was let in. He went to sleep in a cabin where, according to the case against his stepbrother, his older sister's body lay concealed beneath the very bed nearby. He had absolutely no idea. None. He simply closed his eyes in a room that had, hours earlier, become a crime scene that nobody in it yet recognized as one. She was not discovered until the following morning. Try to sit inside that image for a moment, because it is the kind of detail that doesn't need embellishment to be devastating. Sunlight coming through a porthole, the low hum and gentle sway of a cruise ship steadily making its way back toward Miami, toward the end of a vacation that was supposed to end in nothing more dramatic than unpacked suitcases and 1,000 vacation photos. And somewhere in that same small cabin, underneath a bed, beneath equipment built to save lives, lay the body of an 18-year-old girl who had died hours earlier while her family slept nearby, unaware. Somewhere on that same morning, elsewhere on the ship, the ordinary machinery of a cruise vacation was still running exactly as scheduled. Breakfast buffets were being restocked. Pool towels were being handed out at the deck entrance. Passengers who had no connection whatsoever to cabin 8343 were applying sunscreen and debating which excursion to take once the ship docked. The horror inside that one room existed, for a window of time, entirely apart from the normal rhythm of the rest of the ship, sealed off, undiscovered, while a few hundred feet away, vacation continued exactly as advertised. That contrast between the mundane churn of a cruise ship's morning routine and the stillness inside a single cabin is the kind of detail that true crime cannot manufacture. It simply happened that way. When Anna's body was found, the entire character of the investigation shifted. This was not a medical emergency. This was not a tragic accident. A fall, a seizure, an undiagnosed condition finally catching up with a young body at the worst possible moment. The findings from the medical examiner, asphyxiation, evidence consistent with sexual assault, the specific and deliberate concealment of the body, made clear almost immediately that the ship's crew, and soon the FBI, were looking at a homicide. And this is where the case runs into its first true complication, the detail that turns a devastating family tragedy into a constitutional and jurisdictional puzzle. When Anna Kepner died, the Carnival horizon was in international waters, not within the boundaries of Florida, not within the legal reach of Jamaica or the Cayman Islands or Mexico, all of which the ship had visited on its itinerary. International waters, the vast legal gray zone of the open ocean, where no single nation automatically holds jurisdiction over crimes committed aboard a vessel simply passing through. Crimes that occur there fall instead under federal and maritime law, prosecuted not by a local district attorney in Brevard County, but by the United States Attorney's Office, in federal court, under a body of law most Americans have never had reason to think about. And that single jurisdictional detail would end up shaping nearly everything that followed, including, eventually, the controversial decisions about whether a 16-year-old accused of this crime should be detained or released while awaiting trial. FBI Miami opened a federal investigation, and the evidence they began assembling, piece by piece, painted an increasingly disturbing picture, even as it remained, crucially, circumstantial rather than a confession, inference rather than an admission. Surveillance footage from across the ship became central to the government's case. Prosecutors allege that CCTV captured Timothy Hudson entering the cabin during the precise window when Anna was last seen alive, corroborating in their telling the theory that he was present with her in those final, unaccounted-for hours. Prosecutors further allege that surveillance captured him later that night disposing of something on an entirely different deck of the ship. Anna's cell phone, smashed, hidden inside a trash can far from the cabin where she had last used it. Ask yourself the obvious question a jury will eventually be asked to consider. Why would someone smash and hide another person's phone in a location deliberately distant from where that person was last seen, unless they wanted to prevent anyone from reconstructing her final messages, her final movements, her final hour alive? People misplace phones. People drop them. People rarely smash them and carry the pieces to a different floor of a ship, specifically to conceal them in a trash receptacle. And then there is one more piece of alleged surveillance evidence that, on its own, might be circumstantial, but stacked against everything else, becomes harder to dismiss. Prosecutors say footage shows Timothy walking past the cabin again later, after Anna's body had already been discovered and the area had become an active crime scene. Not entering, not assisting, simply walking past, as if checking, as if confirming something, as if needing, for reasons the prosecution argues speak to guilt, to see the scene with his own eyes after it had already been found. Given the severity of what investigators believed they were looking at, you might assume the legal system moved immediately and decisively to detain him. It didn't. Not at first, and arguably not fully even now. Because of his age, Timothy Hudson was initially charged as a juvenile. Rather than being held in a secure juvenile detention facility for the duration of the investigation, he was released into the custody of an uncle, a 16-year-old accused of one of the most violent crimes the federal government investigates, living in a private home with a relative, while FBI Miami and federal prosecutors spent months building the case that would eventually become a formal indictment. Then, in April of 2026, the legal ground shifted beneath him. A federal grand jury indicted Timothy Hudson as an adult, first-degree murder, aggravated sexual abuse. These are not juvenile court charges with the comparatively softer outcomes the juvenile system is designed around. These are adult federal charges that, if proven at trial, carry the possibility of spending the rest of his natural life in federal prison. Surely, you might think, this is the moment everything changes. Surely a federal indictment for first-degree murder and aggravated sexual abuse means immediate detention, a cell, a jumpsuit, a wait for trial behind bars, rather than behind the front door of a relative's house. It didn't happen that way. On May 27, 2026, Timothy Hudson appeared inside the James Lawrence King Federal Justice Building in Miami. Federal prosecutors stood before a judge and asked, formally, for his release to be revoked, for the custody arrangement that had let him live with relatives since his arrest to end, and for him to be detained for the remainder of the pretrial process. Assistant U.S. Attorney Alejandra Lopez laid out the government's case in stark terms inside that courtroom. She told the judge that the autopsy findings showed Anna had been pinned down and violently raped. She reiterated, specifically and deliberately, the 3 to 5 minute time frame prosecutors believe it took to strangle her, a detail she emphasized precisely because of the inference it invites. Not a sudden, momentary loss of control, but a sustained, continuous act. I believe there is clear and convincing evidence that this defendant is a danger to the community, Lopez told the court, in language federal prosecutors reserve for exactly the kind of situation they believe this case represents. The judge listened to all of it, and then he did not rule. He ended the hearing without a final decision, telling the courtroom he wanted to consult with the United States Marshals Service about the practical logistics of detention. Specifically, whether Hudson could be housed somewhere in Central Florida, closer to his family, rather than in South Florida, where the eventual trial itself will take place. A question of geography and convenience, raised in the same breath as testimony about a 3 to 5 minute strangulation and a body hidden under life vests. Timothy Hudson walked out of that federal courthouse a free man. Again, no ruling, no detention order. Photographers captured him leaving the building on May 27, 2026. 16 years old, his attorney at his side, walking past a line of cameras and reporters, and back out into a world that, according to the federal government's own prosecutor, he posed a documented danger to. Imagine being in that room as a reporter, or as a family member, watching a teenager stand quietly beside his attorney while a federal prosecutor describes, almost clinically, the minutes it allegedly took for him to end someone's life, and then watching that same teenager walk out through the same doors everyone else uses, into the same Miami afternoon, with no handcuffs, no transport van waiting, nothing visibly different about his circumstances than before the hearing began. The legal logic behind that outcome exists, rooted in due process and the specific procedural posture of a case still awaiting a formal detention ruling. But the emotional logic of it, the sheer dissonance between the gravity of the allegations and the ordinariness of his exit, is exactly what makes this story resonate so deeply with people far outside this one Florida family. Anna's father had already made his own position painfully clear, weeks before this hearing, in an interview he gave to ABC News on a day that should have meant something entirely different for his family. It was the day of Anna's scheduled high school graduation. Instead of watching his daughter cross a stage, Christopher Kepner stood in her place and accepted her diploma on her behalf, in front of a gymnasium of strangers and classmates who knew exactly why he was the one standing there. In that interview, he didn't soften his words. He said his stepson did not need to be free. He said Timothy did not need to be in the general public. He said, and this is a direct public statement from a man who helped raise this boy, who shared a home and a dinner table, and presumably years of ordinary family life with him, that Timothy should not be around any kids or women in general. Think about the distance that sentence has to travel to be spoken out loud. This is not a stranger commenting on a news story. This is a stepfather describing the boy he helped raise, in terms typically reserved for describing someone the public needs to be actively protected from. Then came June. Newly unsealed court documents revealed additional disturbing detail, including, according to court filings, that Anna's underwear had been positioned in a specific way following the assault, a detail prosecutors say supports their account of what occurred inside that cabin. And on June 8th, federal prosecutors filed something unusual even by the standards of this already extraordinary case, a new submission of evidence, entered entirely under seal, not available to the public. not available to reporters covering the case daily. Hidden from view, accessible only to the court and the legal teams directly involved. What, specifically, is contained in that sealed filing? As of this video, nobody outside the case knows for certain, but the act of filing it, quietly, deliberately, in support of a renewed push to revoke Hudson's release, tells its own story. Whatever federal prosecutors found was significant enough that they returned to court a second time, asking once more for him to be detained, rather than simply waiting for the original ruling to eventually come down. And here, the story splits cleanly into two competing narratives, both still unresolved, both still being argued, as you are hearing this right now. On one side stands a family member of the Hudsons, who has publicly pushed back against the picture federal prosecutors have painted. She has questioned whether alcohol was a factor that night. She has questioned whether a missed medication played some role. She has questioned whether these teenagers, step-siblings who, as she's pointed out, were not raised together from childhood and were not bonded the way biological siblings often are, were simply placed into a high-risk situation without adequate adult supervision. A recipe for disaster, in her own words. She has defended Timothy's account of that night directly, stating that across every single interview he has given investigators, his story has remained consistent. He says he doesn't remember what happened, and according to her, he has never changed that account. Not once, across however many times he's been asked to give it. The Kepner family, for its part, has firmly denied that alcohol was provided to the teenagers aboard that ship. On the other side of this divide stands a federal prosecutor who stood in open court and described, in specific, documented, evidence-based terms, what the government believes happened to an 18-year-old girl behind a locked cabin door. A CCTV timeline placing him at the scene. A smashed phone deliberately hidden far from where it should have logically ended up. A body concealed beneath flotation devices meant to save lives. Every light in a cabin blazing at nearly midnight, while a 13-year-old waited outside a door he was told not to enter. Both of these accounts exist, right now, in the same case file. A teenager who says he cannot remember anything that happened, and a federal case built on a foundation of surveillance footage, forensic findings, and behavioral evidence that prosecutors argue points towards something far more deliberate than a memory simply failing to form. Claims of memory loss occupy a strange and often skeptical place in criminal law. Courts have heard them in cases involving extreme intoxication, severe psychological trauma, dissociative episodes triggered by violence, and juries are typically asked to weigh those claims not against some objective medical test of what a person does or doesn't remember, since no such reliable test exists, but against the totality of behavior surrounding the claim itself. Does the behavior look like someone in a genuine fog, disoriented, and unaware of their own actions? Or does it look like someone making calculated decisions, blocking a doorway, smashing a phone, choosing a trash can on a distant deck rather than the nearest one? Decisions that suggest awareness rather than absence. That is the exact question prosecutors will be asking the jury to answer in September, and it is the exact question Hudson's defense will be working just as hard to frame in the opposite direction. The judge in this case still has not issued a final ruling on detention. The trial date remains set for September of 2026. Timothy Hudson has pleaded not guilty to every charge against him, and as of this recording, he remains free, living somewhere in the state of Florida, waiting, along with everyone else connected to this case, for a courtroom to eventually decide what actually happened inside cabin 8343 on the night of November 6th. There is something almost unbearable about the procedural slowness of all this, when you set it against the speed of what allegedly happened in that cabin. 3 to 5 minutes to end a life, and then, on the other side of that, months upon months of hearings, filings, sealed evidence, and unresolved motions, a legal process moving at the deliberate, grinding pace that due process requires. While a family waits, and a community watches, and a 16-year-old continues to wake up each morning in a house somewhere in Florida rather than in a federal detention facility. Consider, too, what this case reveals about the limits of what surveillance footage and forensic science can actually tell us, even when they tell us quite a lot. Cameras on that ship captured entrances and exits, captured a young man near a trash can on a deck far from where he should have had any reason to be, captured him walking past a sealed-off cabin after a body had already been found inside it. What those cameras could not capture is what happened behind a closed door, in a space no lens was pointed at, during the exact minutes when everything irreversible took place. That gap between what was recorded and what can never be recorded is precisely where this case will ultimately be won or lost, not on a single piece of footage showing the act itself, because no such footage exists. On the accumulated weight of everything surrounding that gap, all the circumstantial evidence prosecutors have stitched together into a timeline they believe, beyond reasonable doubt, points toward a single, inescapable conclusion. And there is the matter of the sealed evidence, still sitting unexamined by the public. We don't know what it says. We don't know if it strengthens the government's case in some decisive new way, or simply adds detail to a picture that was already disturbing enough. What we do know is that prosecutors considered it significant enough to file specifically in support of detaining a defendant who has, up to that point, twice walked free from federal court. In a case already saturated with unsettling detail, the timeline, the smashed phone, the lights blazing at midnight, the autopsy findings, the existence of evidence serious enough to be filed under seal suggests there may be more to this story than what has already become public. We may not know what that is until the trial itself, if it is introduced there at all. It's worth pausing on the family fracture this case has exposed as well, because it says something larger about how families process unthinkable accusations against one of their own. On one side, a relative defending Timothy's consistency, his claimed inability to remember, framing the entire tragedy as a preventable failure of supervision rather than an act of intention. On the other, Anna's father, a man who occupied the same complicated blended family role from the opposite direction, describing his own stepson in the kind of language usually reserved for warning the public about a stranger. Two people, both connected to this same boy through marriage and family, arriving at entirely opposite conclusions about who he is and what he's capable of. That split runs straight through the middle of this case, and it will likely run straight through the middle of the jury box in September 2. When 12 strangers are asked to decide which version of Timothy Hudson the evidence actually supports. What should not get lost, in the middle of all this legal architecture, the jurisdiction, the maritime law, the juvenile to adult reclassification, the detention hearings, is that this entire case exists because a real 18-year-old girl went to her cabin early one night because her stomach hurt and never came back out alive. Every procedural twist in this story, every hearing and filing and unresolved motion, traces back to that single, devastating fact. It is easy, in true crime storytelling, to get pulled into the mechanics of a case, the timelines, the footage, the legal maneuvering, and to lose sight of the person at the actual center of it. Anna Kepner is not a plot device in a story about jurisdictional loopholes. She is the reason this story is being told at all. So why does this story matter? Why should a case still working its way through federal pretrial procedure, with no verdict and no resolution, deserve this much attention before it has even reached a jury? Because this case sits squarely on top of some of the most uncomfortable, unresolved questions our legal system has never managed to answer cleanly. What, precisely, do we owe a 16-year-old accused of committing an adult's crime? At what point does youth stop functioning as a legitimate mitigating factor in how the law treats a person, and start functioning instead as something closer to a procedural shield, a reason charges get softened, releases get granted, and detention decisions get endlessly deferred, even when the alleged conduct itself bears none of the markers we typically associate with childhood impulsivity? There is a colder question sitting just beneath that one. What happens inside our legal system when "I don't remember" becomes something closer to a strategy than an honest account of events? We will likely never know, with the kind of certainty a true crime audience craves, exactly what was happening inside Timothy Hudson's mind on the night of November 6, 2025. But the law was never designed to require that kind of certainty about a person's interior thoughts. It requires evidence of conduct, of what a person's hands did, what a body did, what a camera captured someone doing in the hours surrounding a death. And in this case, according to federal prosecutors, that evidence exists in abundance, even without a single moment of footage showing the act itself. Anna Kepner did not get to choose any part of how this story unfolded. She didn't choose the cabin assignment that placed her in close quarters with a stepbrother she may have already had reservations about. She didn't choose what happened to her in the final, unaccounted-for hours of November 6th. She was 18 years old. She had just finished her junior year, cheering for a small Christian school in a town shadowed by rocket launches. She had a boyfriend who cared enough to notice and remember when something about her stepbrother felt wrong to her. She had, by every single account from people who actually knew her, a future that looked bright, ordinary, and entirely hers to walk into. She should have graduated this spring. She should have stood on a stage in a cap and gown, taken a photo holding her diploma at arm's length the way every graduate does, hugged her father afterward in the gymnasium parking lot while someone's phone camera caught the moment for an album that would have sat, mostly unviewed, on a shelf for the next 30 years. Instead, her father stood on that stage in her place. He accepted her diploma alone, in front of a crowd of people honoring graduates who got the chance to grow into whatever they were going to become. That is what was actually taken from her, beyond the obvious and unbearable fact of her death. Not simply a life that ended, an entire unwritten future that will now never exist in any form. The college she might have attended, the career she might have built, the version of herself at 25, at 30, at 50, that the rest of us will simply never get to see, because that future was erased in a locked cabin somewhere over international waters. And right now, the person the federal government has accused of erasing it is living somewhere in Florida, free, waiting for a trial scheduled in September, while a judge moves carefully, through hearings, through requests for sealed evidence, through questions about which detention facility might be most logistically convenient, toward a decision about whether the danger he allegedly represents outweighs his legal right to remain free until a jury says otherwise. That tension is not going to resolve neatly inside this video. It will not resolve cleanly even when the September trial finally begins, and it may not resolve cleanly even after a verdict is eventually reached, whatever that verdict turns out to be. That tension, between the presumption of innocence every accused person in this country is constitutionally owed, and the visceral, almost unbearable horror embedded in what prosecutors say the evidence shows, is, uncomfortably, what real justice often looks like while it's still in progress. Slow, procedural, frustrating to anyone who wants a clean, immediate answer to a question this serious. There's a broader reckoning embedded in this story too, one that extends well past Anna Kepner and Timothy Hudson specifically. Cruise ships exist in a strange legal twilight that most passengers never think about until something goes wrong aboard one. Millions of families board these ships every year, trusting, implicitly, that the same protections and emergency systems that exist on land extend out onto the water with them. They largely do not in the same form, not with the same immediacy. When something happens in international waters, the nearest police department isn't 5 minutes away. The nearest detective isn't already familiar with the family, the neighborhood, the context that might normally inform an investigation. Instead, what exists is a patchwork of maritime law, FBI jurisdiction triggered specifically by the location of the vessel, and an investigative process that has to be built almost entirely after the fact, reconstructed from camera footage and keycard data and whatever physical evidence survived the time it took anyone to realize a crime had occurred at all. That has real consequences for how a case like this unfolds. It's part of why Anna's death wasn't immediately treated as a matter for local police, for fingerprinting at a scene by detectives who might have already known her family, for charges filed in a courthouse close to the town where she grew up. Instead, it became a federal matter, handled in Miami, under laws written largely to govern crimes on the high seas, rather than crimes between family members sharing a cabin. The system was never built with a case exactly like this one in mind, and that mismatch between the kind of crime alleged here and the legal framework available to prosecute it is part of why this case has moved as slowly and as controversially as it has. Millions of people will board a cruise ship this year without ever learning any of this, without knowing that the legal protections they assume travel with them onto the water are thinner, stranger, and more jurisdictionally complicated than almost anyone realizes until a case like Anna's forces the question into public view. That is, in its own quiet way, part of why this story matters beyond the specific family at its center. It is a window into a gap most of us never think to look for, in a system most of us never think to question, until it's too late to matter for the family standing at the center of it. But regardless of how September ends, regardless of what a jury eventually decides about Timothy Hudson, Anna Kepner's name deserves to be remembered as something more than a headline about a cruise ship and a cabin number. She was not simply the cheerleader who died at sea. She was a person, bubbly enough, beloved enough, present enough in the lives of the people around her that her own high school valedictorian could not finish his graduation speech without breaking down over the simple act of saying her name out loud to a room that already understood she would never answer. If this story unsettled you, and it should have, don't let that feeling disappear the moment this video ends. Pay attention to what actually happens in September. Follow this case through to its real conclusion, not simply through whichever headline trends loudest in the moment. When court documents are unsealed, read them yourself if you're able to, rather than relying entirely on secondhand summaries filtered through whoever covers it fastest. Cases this complicated, this legally tangled, depend on an audience willing to stay engaged long after the algorithm has already moved on to the next viral story. And if you are currently building a blended family of your own, putting kids who barely know each other into shared vacations, shared rooms, shared spaces, trusting that time and proximity alone will eventually make them feel like siblings, let this story serve as an uncomfortable but necessary reminder. Supervision is not paranoia, it is protection. Ask the difficult questions now, while you still have the chance to ask them, rather than after you no longer do. Anna Kepner's story is not finished. The very least any of us can do is keep watching, and keep paying attention, until it actually is.